Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes as we let the room fill. So just hang tight. We'll get started shortly. Hello, everyone. Welcome to those of you that are just joining us. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes. Just waiting for the room to fill a little. So just feel free to hang out. Introduce yourselves in the chat if you'd like. We'll get started in about a minute or two. Hello, everyone. Those of you that are just joining us, we're going to get started in just a couple of minutes. So just feel free to hang out. We're going to get started in about a minute or two. We're just waiting for the room to fill in a little. Thank you. Hello, welcome to those of you that are just joining us. We're going to get started in a couple of minutes. I'm going to keep repeating the message for a little bit, but we're just waiting for the room to fill in. Just feel free to hang out, introduce yourselves in the chat. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes. Hello, welcome those of you that are just joining us. We're just waiting for the room to fill in just for one more minute and then we'll get started. Cool, we'll go ahead and get started. Well, hello everyone. Thank you for joining the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. My name is Herman Calderon. I'm the community manager at TechEquity Collaborative. And in my role, I get to engage with some of our supporters through volunteer opportunities and events, and I get to engage with you all here. So feel free to drop in questions into the Q&A box on the bottom of your screens as we go throughout the presentation, but we won't be answering any of those questions until the end. This webinar is also being recorded, and we will send out the recording and the slides afterwards to everyone who joined today. So a little bit about what I'll be talking about today. I'll talk about why TechEquity exists as an organization and how we got started. I'll talk about the key issues we've identified to help us understand the problems that need to be solved. And I'll talk about how we can take action to address some of our most pressing economic issues. So first, we'll begin with why we're here. Well, TechEquity got started because some of its earliest founders and members saw these growing symptoms of inequity in their neighborhoods, and they understood that there was this perception that tech and tech workers were the cause of this problem. And so they noticed things such as rising rents, increases in displacement, increases in traffic, and increases in people experiencing homelessness. And as they talked to others, they realized that they weren't alone in their concerns and that they as tech workers were uniquely positioned to help contribute to some of the solutions that would address these economic inequities. And especially now in the face of the pandemic, we're seeing that the affordability crisis gets so much worse with an increased burden placed on lower income people and communities of color. And many of our neighbors are uncertain as to how they'll continue to manage what was already an untenable situation. And at the same time, tech workers have remained relatively unscathed. So as a result, the pandemic has the potential to even further exacerbate some of the inequity that our community has already been seeing for the last couple of years. And because of this affordability crisis, communities are frustrated. And it really is no surprise. I know for myself, I've grown up in the Bay Area my whole life, and I've been able to see both sides of the coin. I have friends and family who have who are worried about all the changes that they're seeing in their communities and what that means for them, and what that means for their living situations, their work situations. But I also have friends and family who pursue jobs within tech and have found lots of success for themselves and for their families alike. However, we see that when tech shoulders the blame, it starts to create an us versus them dynamic that's further dividing our communities. And we know that tech workers care and that they want to help and that they don't want to contribute to this deepening divide within our region. So while we're all unsure as to how long we'll be managing this new normal that was caused by the pandemic, it's important to note that many within the tech sector have remained relatively unscathed. And more than most other sectors, tech has been able to make the transition to working from home with little to no disruption. And now more than ever, tech workers and tech companies have an opportunity to support more equitable solutions in our communities. And we have an opportunity to use our positions of privilege to support our neighbors, but it can be hard to know how to best engage in times of such uncertainty as we just talked about. So this is the state of our affordability crisis, at least in the Bay Area. And the fact that rents are rising, I don't think is a surprise to anyone on this call because we already know, we feel this, we've heard this from friends and family. And while some Californians are very successful in the tech-driven economy here, the average salaries for tenants have actually decreased slightly throughout the years. And we're showing stats here in California because that's where we're based as an organization and it's where tech is headquartered, but a version of this is playing out all across the country. And it really is a sharp contrast with the narrative of tech success. And without tech at the table to address our shared crisis, it's understandable as to why communities are frustrated, like we just talked about. And just before the pandemic, unemployment was hovering around just 4%, and people were struggling to make ends meet. And when the virus hit, unemployment claims had spiked to 16%, which is a more dramatic spike than our last recession. So in the span of a month, we lost decades worth of recovery. And as instability and uncertainty continues, we'll see more of our neighbors being pushed into homelessness or worse. However, at TechEquity, we're as optimistic as ever about the tech industry's potential to drive broad-based growth that's accessible to everyone, but it's clear that it's not going to happen on its own. We have to show up and we have to invest in the people and the institutions that are serving our communities. And we have to show up in partnership with those in the community that are feeling the most pain if we're to dismantle this notion that tech is the enemy. We believe that a more engaged tech sector is a more ethical tech sector, that connecting workers and companies to issues where they live in will result in more ethical decisions at work and more engagement in our communities. And we know we can do this. And the first step is to show up. And you all have done a great first step by signing on to this webinar and learning a little bit more about how to get involved today. Our goal at TechEquity is to change the conditions in which the tech sector is growing. So we believe that effective structural change will eliminate a culture and policies that have institutionalized inequity, leading to stronger and more resilient communities. And we help tech workers approach these big problems and engage in the system change in three major ways. So our programs educate you about the most critical civic issues where you live. And we do this in a variety of ways. We host book club discussions, panel discussions with experts. We host webinars such as the one you're on right now. We produce voter guides around voter season, blog posts with a bunch of resources for you to get educated. And we advocate for public policy that rebalances power and builds economic equity. And a perfect example of this is the Tenant Protection Act of 2019, which extends protections to 8 million California renters, preventing unjust evictions and the price gouging of rents. So that was a bill that we worked on in a coalition together with state legislators, community partners, community members that were at risk of eviction. And together we were able to pass these tenant protections. So this is just an example of some of the public policy work that we're doing on a day-to-day to help advance some of these issues. And finally, there's corporate practice, aiming to turn companies into agents of equity in the broader community. And we do this through our corporate partnerships and engagements. Tech workers have this outsized political power that's largely been untapped when it comes to public policy advocacy. So connecting tech workers to outside perspectives builds more empathy and ethical practices in our workplaces, in our products, and in our surrounding communities. Our two issue areas at TechEquity are housing and workforce and labor. So while housing costs are a core part of this, the issues really are intertwined and intersect in a variety of ways because where you live affects your access to opportunity, and what job you have affects where you're able to afford to live. Our goal at TechEquity is bold, comprehensive change by companies and government that's led by the tech workforce. And as we talked about, these issues have only gotten more urgent in the face of the pandemic, but we're all well positioned to adapt our agendas to these new realities. While the pandemic has exposed the cracks of our economy, these underlying issues have always existed in our economy for decades. So let's learn a little bit more about inequity within our own neighborhoods. So this affordability crisis is decades in the making. The policy choices that we've made over the course of decades has set us up for this level of pain our community is feeling, especially now during the pandemic. So in the 1930s, the federal government instituted a policy that's still felt today, especially by communities of color in the Bay Area and in California and all across the country. And that policy is redlining. So redlining was a process in which the Homeowners Loan Corporation, a federal agency, gave neighborhoods ratings to guide investment. And this policy is named for the red or hazardous neighborhoods that were deemed the riskiest. So on maps, those neighborhoods were literally redlined. And those communities that were deemed risky for investment or redlined didn't receive any investment. And these neighborhoods were predominantly home to communities of color. And that really is by no accident. The hazardous ratings were in large part based on racial demographics. So in other words, redlining was a discriminatory and a racist policy, and it made it hard for residents to get loans for home ownership or maintenance of their homes for something like building a new roof, and consequently led to cycles of disinvestment and production within these neighborhoods. So there's a terrible history of underinvestment, underbuilding, and exclusion in our country. And often those communities that have been historically underinvested in and have been redlined are the very same communities that are at risk of gentrification today. The crisis we're living in is decades in the making, way before tech, and it's not unique to the Bay Area. It extends all across California and all across the country. So these are examples of redline neighborhoods in Austin and Atlanta, two up and coming tech hubs. And once again, all those redlined blocks that you see on the maps are neighborhoods that have been historically redlined. So by preventing entire communities from being able to access this capital, these neighborhoods were unable to build schools that they needed, small businesses, and a community that really fostered economic success and opportunity. And it caused many of the people who lived in redline neighborhoods for generations to fall in and stay in liquid asset poverty. Now, you may be asking yourself, what is liquid asset poverty? Well, someone is considered to be in liquid asset poverty if they don't have enough savings to cover their basic expenses for 3 months after experiencing an income shock. And an income shock can be a huge rent increase. You suddenly lose your job. Your car breaks down and you have a huge bill. And it impacts almost 1 out of 3 Californians. So 33.9% of Californians are in liquid asset poverty, and people of color and lower income people are affected at much higher rates. So 41.2% of African American households are in liquid asset poverty, and 56.2% of Latino households are in liquid asset poverty. And there really isn't a single reason as to why this is happening, but many years of policy decisions have led to these outcomes, which are especially burdensome for communities of color. And these policy decisions have often predated tech's arrival, but tech workers can now take a role in supporting better policies moving forward. The twin forces of a housing shortage, particularly with affordable housing and wages that don't cover the cost of living, have created an opportunity that has hindered opportunity, growth, and prosperity for families and businesses alike. And as you can imagine, these statistics will likely be impacted by the outcomes of the pandemic. Like we talked about, many of our communities were already struggling. And as the pandemic recovery continues to be starkly uneven and unequal, many of our neighbors are facing increased instability and likely will for years to come if we don't implement the necessary solutions now. So by preventing entire neighborhoods from being able to access this capital, as we can see, the hourly pay for workers has not increased much. And these last couple of decades, even though productivity has dramatically increased. So according to the Economic Policy Institute, the share of workers covered by a collective bargaining agreement, aka unions, dropped from 27% to 11.6% between 1979 and 2019, meaning that the union coverage rate is now less than half where it was 40 years ago. So what does this mean? This just means that employees have less bargaining power to advocate for better pay rates in alignment with the work that they're delivering. And while all workers have lost out because of this, Black, Indigenous, and people of color are the most impacted. While there's a gap between worker pay and productivity, like we just talked about, there's also a gap between race. So this graph is showing us that white men are earning more cents to the dollar. It's that orange bar on the left side of your screen in comparison to Black men and women, the blue bars on the right side of your screen. So because Black, Indigenous, and people of color are getting paid less and disproportionately, they're not able to afford living in cities that are providing good jobs. So the cost of living here was already high. So let's take a look at what a worker earning minimum wage fares in the current rental market. So this is what it takes to afford the average 2-bedroom apartment in San Francisco. If you're making $133,000 a year, you can afford the average 2-bedroom working a regular 8-hour day. However, if you're making minimum wage in San Francisco, you'd need to work 40 hours a day to afford that 2-bedroom. Again, if you're making minimum wage, you need to work 40 hours a day to afford a 2-bedroom apartment. So there's only 24 hours in a day. So we're setting up an impossible situation for low-wage workers to be able to afford living in the city where they work in. And this problem persists all across the country. So even though there's up-and-coming tech cities like Austin, Denver, and Atlanta, where the costs aren't as high, the cost of living is still unreasonable for anyone earning minimum wage. And in San Francisco, it's not just people outside the tech sector that are struggling to afford the city. There's this common misperception that all tech workers are paid these lavish salaries. However, not every salaried employee is making 6 figures. Some salaried tech employees, like those in customer success and marketing, are paid salaries that are considered to be low income in the Bay Area. And even further away from this image of a wealthy tech worker are the thousands of contractors and contingent workers like security guards, custodians, cooks, bus drivers, who are working long hours to maintain tech companies, but are receiving minimum benefits and are not paid as much. So you have to have a good salary to afford your apartment, but why is your apartment so expensive to begin with? Well, rents are going up due in part to lack of supply, and this chart is showing us what we should be building. So the state sets goals for how much housing local communities should build to keep up with demand and population growth. And these are called RHNA goals, RHNA, and if that stands for Regional Housing Needs Allocation. So as you can see, we're doing a pretty good job at meeting our RHNA goal for the above moderate income housing bracket. That's that big blue bar on the right side of your screen. And that's affordable to people making a good salary like we just talked about. But we're not building anywhere close enough housing for lower and moderate income people. Those are the 2 red bars on the left side of your screen. And as housing costs have skyrocketed with production of affordable housing not being matched, working class residents and communities of color have been driven out of our urban core and pushed into the outer edges of our region, further away from job centers and further away from supportive services. And some residents have been displaced from the region altogether. So remember, when someone tells you that we just need to build more housing, it's important that we ask them, build more housing for whom? Again, we're not building enough housing at lower levels of affordability. Because we're not building enough housing at lower levels of affordability, people with lower and middle incomes are leaving our communities while those with higher incomes are coming in and staying in. So this chart is showing us how people in lower incomes, those orange bars, have left San Francisco at higher rates than people with higher incomes have increased migration into the city. And so people with beneath 30% AMI are in a more drastic situation where they can't even afford to leave San Francisco, and they're being pushed into homelessness or worse. So that's why that last blue bar is actually increasing, because there just isn't enough affordable housing available to help support the most vulnerable members in our community. And amongst people of color, the rates of displacement are even more tragic. So as we talked about earlier, Black and Latino populations are living at higher rates of liquid asset poverty. And furthermore, Black and Latino populations have been leaving San Francisco at higher rates over the past couple of years. So a combination of discriminatory housing laws, low wages, lack of affordable housing production have really created this crisis of displacement. And displacement is driven by policy choices. And we may see this ratio of displacement continue to rise as the pandemic continues to progress, because like we talked about, the folks who are the most rent burdened are in low wage jobs, and low wage jobs are getting hit the hardest by the crisis. And we can't build our way out to solve our problems, but it is true that we don't have enough homes for people. The good news is that members at TechEquity are showing up for the community. Tech workers are members of the community and should be at the table working together to address some of the solutions to our region's most pressing shared problems. And we have to work together to address these underlying issues that are driving inequity within our economy. So as you can see, the affordability crisis we're living out today is a result of years and years of bad policy choices. But like we said, the good news is that we can make a different set of choices moving forward. At TechEquity, we envision a world where a growing tech-driven economy creates opportunity for everyone, where tech sector employees and companies are engaged and active participants in making our communities better places to live. And we've identified structural changes that need to happen in order to achieve this vision, but we won't be able to achieve it without the necessary policy changes. And so here's what we've identified in the housing world. We need to take an above all approach to tackling our housing affordability crisis. And that starts with production. So building more housing, specifically at lower levels of affordability, and we can do this through zoning and permitting reform, bringing down the cost of constructing housing by removing delays and lengthy administrative processes that make it too expensive to build. Preservation, making sure that we're providing more resources to subsidize and maintain and improve existing affordable housing stock. Protection, we need to protect existing tenants from displacement. It's going to take a long time to build the necessary housing that we need. So in the meantime, we need to make sure that existing tenants are protected from displacement. Racial equity. Racism is embedded in our economic, political, in our social systems. It's embedded in us all, and especially within housing. And that means that we have to be explicit about how racism and racial bias are upheld in housing so that we can craft policy solutions that are building racial equity in response. Especially now, we have to be thinking about short and long-term solutions for preservation and protection, because many of our neighbors are at risk as a result of the pandemic. We also need to make sure that we all get enough compensation and benefits to live a healthy and stable life. We want to ensure that companies are doing their part to contribute to their communities they exist within, that people in the surrounding communities are able to access these jobs, and that these jobs are paying fair wages and benefits regardless of the role that they're in. And we need to make sure that all workers are protected. Within the tech sector, we see large disparities emerging between headquarters, warehouse, and contract workers. So in partnership with Silicon Valley Rising, we created a standard that tech companies should implement for contract workers, which includes creating space for workers to have a voice, providing career mobility opportunities, good wages and benefits, and making sure that the workplace is safe and ensuring that there's fair scheduling. We need to expand and equip the workforce. So training as a standalone approach will not lead us out of inequality and will not guarantee employment for most displaced workers. So in order to solve this crisis, we must undertake multiple strategies, massive job programs, high labor standards and protections for all jobs, and innovative recruitment, training, and development of new and diverse talent. At the same time, the tech industry has an imperative to make its employee base more representative of the population at large, not just to create broader economic opportunity, but because companies with diverse representation at all levels are more likely to be successful than those that aren't. And last, we need to make sure that everyone's basic needs are met. We need a new social contract that ensures that everyone has the basics to survive. We have to strengthen our social safety net so that no one falls through the cracks. So once again, there's tons of ways for you to get involved. We host tons of educational events and social events. So you can check out our events page. It has past event recordings, and we'll be updating those with future events in the next couple of weeks. If you're interested in public policy, you can support our 2022 priority legislation bills, which I'll be talking about shortly. But one of the asks is if you're a former contractor, if you want to share your story to help support one of our projects, the contract worker disparity project, that's one way to do it. Or you can reach out to me afterwards and I can point you in the right direction. For corporate practice, we offer a wide range of services to companies and provide ways for them to get more involved on these issues, from employee engagement to policy advising. So once again, you can reply to our follow-up email. We can connect you with our corporate partnerships manager and get something going. So this is how we work. We try to make it as easy and as accessible as possible to plug in, while also building community in the process. So this year, Key's initiatives begin with the Contract Worker Disparity Project. It's a first of its kind, worker-centered initiative that sheds light on the practice of contracting out, proposes and advocates for public policy solutions, and partners with companies to adopt responsible contracting practices. Next, we have the Tech Bias in Housing Initiative, which is examining the promise and perils of housing technology. So we aim to ensure that technological innovations in the housing space are not reinforcing the racist housing systems and policies of our past. Next, we have passing economic justice policy. So every year, TechEquity introduces a bold policy agenda to address economic inequalities in the housing market and in the workplace. So our priorities this year are housing data transparency, equitable labor standards, affordable housing, data surveillance protections, and more. And finally, we have our System Reset Initiative, which is helping tech companies create on-ramps for people returning from incarceration. So we've been partnering with justice-involved organizations to get System Reset into every tech company in California. And so what can you do today? You can do 3 things right after you get off this call. You can tell a friend about our work. You can sign up for a community conversation, which is just a 30-minute meeting where you chat with me one-on-one. We talk about how you'd like to participate, more information you'd like, or just an opportunity for us to get to know each other. And finally, you can take action with us by supporting some of our priority legislation or becoming a civic tech volunteer. So we have a bunch of projects in which if you'd like to donate some of your technical skills, 3 hours a week, 5 hours a week, we have opportunities like that as well. And so the first bill we have is the Rental Registry. So TechEquity is committed to getting better data about our housing market. Better data means that we can build more accurate policy interventions and ensure that help is being targeted to people who need it the most. So TechEquity is working on a number of campaigns to get better data on housing and ensure that data is being used fairly through our rent registry and algorithmic bias in housing initiatives. So this year we're running our bill AB 2469. So make sure you subscribe to our newsletter, join our Slack to stay updated on this bill. Up next, we have the Pay Transparency for Pay Equity Act, also known as SB 1162, which would make pay equity reports public so that all workers have the information that they need to ensure that there is equal pay for equal work, and ensures that companies create a fair and equal playing field for all workers by posting salaries in the job description and posting promotional opportunities to their existing employees before selecting a candidate. So there's a way to support both of these bills. So make sure that you keep an eye out for more information and opportunities, or like I said, sign up for a community conversation and I can give you more information. On events, we have a bunch of events coming up. We'll be updating our events page shortly, but you can also check out past events with some of our panel discussions and experts we invited to those. So as I mentioned, you can do 3 things right after you get off this call. You can tell a friend about our work, you can sign up for a community conversation, or you can take action and help support some of our bills. So I'm sure that was quite a bit of information. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop them into the Q&A. I'll wait for like a minute or two to see if you all have any questions. But as I mentioned, I'll be sending out a copy of the slides and I'll be sending out a link to the recording of this presentation so you can share with your friends. And then if you do have a question later, feel free to reply to that email. And yeah. Cool. So I'm not seeing any questions. That's all good. Thank you for your time today. We hope you feel inspired to join this growing movement. Hope that you can come to a future event, sign up for a community conversation. And yeah, if you have any questions, let me know in the follow-up email. Just keep an eye out for it later this afternoon. Thank you.